Today's risk management presentation is called Risk from the Headlines. Medmarc's risk management team discusses lessons learned from life sciences in the news. Together, this group works to help Medmarc insureds identify product liability exposures and create risk management solutions to make products safer and control losses and costs. All members of the team bring a legal background to their work. Sarah Dyson manages the risk management function and has been with Medmarc for 13 years. Kate Klaus specializes in FDA compliance. Prior to joining Medmarc, Kate worked with both for FDA and in private practice, counseling life sciences companies on compliance matters. Kate has also been with Medmarc for 5 years. Courtney Young regularly advises Medmarc's insureds on contractual risk transfers, labels and warnings, and post-market issues. She has been with Medmarc for 7 years. I would now like to turn it over to Sarah Dyson, who will begin today's presentation.
Thanks for getting us started, Heather. Welcome, everybody. I thought we would start by providing a context around what we've developed for you today. It really grew out of some conversations that Courtney, Kate, and I have been having around the office lately, and I think we have an eye towards year end. And the question that we've been pondering is, what are some of the big news items of 2017? What are the biggest news items of 2017? And in that conversation, the underlying assumption isn't so much what got the most coverage, though some of that does go hand in hand with the topics we're discussing today. But what news items represent issues that are going to have what we think will be the greatest long-term impact on the industry? So we put our heads together, and today's presentation is really a result of that viewpoint, that collective viewpoint. I'm going to start by just doing a brief overview of the agenda, so you'll see what you're about to hear about. We're going to start with new paradigms for clinical research. This is a topic I'm going to handle, and I'm going to talk about why clinical research and the clinical trial process was so prominent in the news this year. Then I'm going to turn things over to Kate, and Kate is going to look at some of the FDA's pilot programs and changing views on quality. And Courtney is going to wrap up the main portion of our presentation today with a look at cybersecurity. Then we're going to close with what we're calling the speed round, which is us hitting a few items of major interest that we also think are relevant and that we should keep our eyes on. Well, I can begin by saying that I selected paradigms in clinical research because I saw that there was a lot of media coverage on it this year. But more importantly, stepping back and looking at the big picture of what I observed, I noticed that in general, the life sciences industry and all of its constituent parts seem to agree, as reflected in the headlines I'm about to show you, that our clinical research process, that process of the clinical trial process, the process of gathering data, the process of analyzing data, and then using that to support product approvals, it seems to be universally acknowledged that the procedure is flawed, that it's a problematic process. But what's interesting is that if you peel back the layer and look a little bit deeper, you will see that industry fundamentally disagrees on why it's problematic or why it's flawed. And I think it's in that disagreement that we're going to get a glimpse of a battle that's going to be waged in the future and maybe where we're headed as far as clinical research is concerned. So let me start at the beginning, and really it tracks with the beginning of the year. This topic hit a lot of news websites and a lot of news outlets very early on because of two things. The first was in January, specifically January 31st, President Trump met with the CEOs of several large pharmaceutical companies, and this meeting was very well publicized. They really talked about three topics. They talked about deregulation, in particular Trump's deregulatory scheme that has come to be known as 1 in 2 out. So for every regulation we pass, we must eliminate 2. The second topic was drug pricing, and I think we're going to actually touch on that a little bit later, with Trump's viewpoint that pharmaceuticals are too costly, and he would be taking a critical eye of the industry in that respect. And then really more close to home for today, he touched on the cost and burden, the time that it takes to get a product to market. And this was covered well in the media, but picked up speed again in March when he chose to make this topic the centerpiece during his first address to Congress. And I think that's significant for FDA and those of us who follow FDA news, that Trump chose this out of all the topics he could choose to highlight during that address. And it was particularly emotional at times because he featured a young lady named Megan Crowley. She's in her 20s now. She's a student at Notre Dame. But most importantly for her history, she suffers from a serious and rare illness that she was diagnosed with at 5 years old. And her father founded a company to find a cure to help his daughter and was largely successful in doing that. But Trump's focus during his presentation was on what came to be quoted numerous times throughout the year as the slow and burdensome approval process. And really what I think underlies that, though he spoke to it only indirectly, is it's almost a code for the amount of research, the clinical trial process, and that the clinical research in its entirety that I described earlier. So one of the quotes that came up most frequently is about the FDA approval process. Trump said that it keeps too many advances, like the one that saved Megan's life, from reaching those in need. If we slash restraints, not just at the FDA, but across our government, then we will be blessed with far more miracles like Megan. Well, industry responded. And as I mentioned earlier, this topic has become somewhat of a tug of war for those in the industry. And it seems to come down to whether or not the industry actually is slow and burdensome, or whether or not we're moving too quickly. So we can agree that the research process is flawed, but the reason that it's flawed, or the character of that flaw, seems to be what's up for debate. And here's sort of a sample representation of the headline that you might have seen during that time period. And I've highlighted in green two quotes that I'm going to really kind of dig in and explain better as we go. The belief that the pendulum has swung too far, and that actually FDA reviews are not as hard as they need to be. They're not as tough as they need to be. So that's sort of the other side. We have Trump representing one side of the spectrum, with this representing the other. But as we get into the details, you might wonder, where does FDA sit on this? Where is their position? And they spoke a lot about this throughout the entire year, but I think it was most succinctly articulated in September of this year by Janet Woodcock, who is the director of FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And she was speaking at a workshop at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. This was on September 20th. And what she was doing was talking about some of the new ways that the 21st Century Cures Act will allow us to collect and utilize patient data during the clinical research process. The quote that became significant, and I think it has become sort of emblematic or symbolic of how FDA views the clinical trial system as a broken system. Just exactly why is it broken, or how will we change things? If we look at what Scott Gottlieb has been up to, I think we'll get some ideas or a notion about where FDA is taking us with this. So first, a word about Scott Gottlieb. He was sworn in as the 23rd Commissioner of the FDA on March 11, 2017, and I would describe him as a bit of a life sciences renaissance man. He is a physician, a medical policy expert, a public health advocate. He was a policy analyst at the American Enterprise Institute, a professor. He was also a deputy commissioner at FDA in the George W. administration. And then, perhaps most notably for those of his critics, Dr. Gottlieb was also an investment banker who invested heavily in life sciences companies, which led to a New York Times headline on March 29, 2017, that said, FDA nominee paid millions by industry, says he'll recuse himself if needed. So Scott Gottlieb is not without controversy, and in this political environment, it seems that there's two views of everything. And on the one hand, we have a view of a very experienced commissioner, experience in the political system, experience at FDA. On the other hand, we have a criticism that he is perhaps too close to the industry that he has been charged with regulating. I would argue, in my personal opinion, that you can be both. And in a moment, I'm going to tell you about some things that I think have surprised industry about Dr. Gottlieb's position. So most importantly with this slide, I wanted to illustrate the variety of things that he has been talking about as far as fixing our broken system. And it's, regardless of how you feel about Dr. Gottlieb, I think he's been quite busy because he's got a lot on his plate. I've just narrowed these headlines down to reforms that he would like to make the clinical process a little bit faster and a little bit more efficient. And I'm going to outline them all, but I should say that with any one of these methods, you could really spend a lot of time studying what they mean and what their specific application and implications will be. I'm just going to do an overview today to give you an idea of where I think we're going to be headed in 2018. First, there's the right to try bills. These gained a lot of traction at the state level first, and there are now 2 bills in Congress that are being considered. What they essentially do is allow a terminally ill American to try unapproved medicines. So these are medicines that have not been approved by the FDA yet. They have, in fact, only passed phase 1 trials. The benefit touted is that the right to try legislation expands access to potentially life-saving treatments to people who need it and can't afford to sit around and await the approval of these products. The downside is, what you might guess, that these are untested products. We simply don't know how they will interact with humans. We don't know what possible adverse effects there are, and they are potentially dangerous. So those are the 2 views of the issue. I mentioned a moment ago that I think Scott Gottlieb has surprised some in industry, or at least surprised those who believed he would be soft on industry, as he was expected to embrace this wholeheartedly. He has not. He testified in Congress as late as October 3rd, and during that testimony, he was focused on the Senate bill, and he actually approached right to try as an issue very conservatively, very cautiously, and advised the Senate to narrow their bill so that it included a smaller patient population who were eligible for a right to try, to restrict the promotion and commercialization of the experimental drugs, to ensure that FDA can take certain enforcement actions against them, and to protect FDA from federal tort liability. Let me emphasize that for you because I'm going to address that again later, to protect the FDA from federal tort liability. So those were his objectives in his recent testimony regarding right to try. Another way that he has proposed changing or appears to be an advocate of changing the clinical research process is by the inclusion of more real-world evidence. Now, what this does is it's intended to fill a knowledge gap between the clinical research that we developed at trial or during trials with how patients are actually using products or drugs in their everyday life. So this is information that is coming more directly from patients themselves, and it's intended to help the sponsor of the trial understand the real-world social context in which patients are using drugs or using products. The goal in the end is to provide key insights that will help drive down medical costs, as well as improve both product safety and effectiveness. So this has been a lot less controversial than right to try. I expect that we're going to see more of this. I think this has received a lot of funding, and FDA is moving full force with making real-world evidence a part of future clinical trials. If you are a company that is engaged in clinical trials now or is thinking of it, expect to see that there will be an emphasis by FDA on the gathering of real-world evidence, and I think we should stay tuned to find out specifically how that's going to be carried out. Another suggestion that he has, it's not Dr. Gottlieb's per se, but that he has presented as the lead of the FDA, is adaptive trials. And this is something that has long been talked about by industry, but probably has received the most political traction recently. And it is a trial design that allows the sponsor to change the statistical procedures as well as the design of the trial itself after initiation of the trial, as evidence and information is gathered as part of the regular research process. The idea here, the goal, is to make clinical trials more flexible, efficient, and fast. And this has received a lot of support from industry, who believes that this is a more nimble way of studying a drug's impact or a device's impact on a human. And I think it's been received pretty well so far as a concept from industry. And then the last idea I'm going to talk about today is the use of data and modeling. So this is the incorporation of software-based tools that have the ability to use different types of models to predict drug efficacy and safety. Dr. Gottlieb is a big fan of this and actually is the author of a blog post. If you're looking at the right-hand corner of the slide, it's how FDA plans to help consumers capitalize on advances in science. He dedicates that blog post, of which he is the author, entirely to this idea of data and modeling and what it can do for the future of clinical trials. So that's another thing you're going to want to watch for. And that I think all four of these ideas add to the tailwind of this topic. I think that it implies long-term changes. I think it implies that the way we're doing clinical trials right now will be different in the future. And so far, the loudest voices are those who are pushing for making the process more efficient, faster, and getting products to market and into the hands of patients sooner. However, let me transition to my next slide, because something happened in the middle of the summer. On August 15th, there were two studies that came out on the same day in the Journal of the American Medical Association. One focused on drug trials and one focused on device trials. Now, the slide that I have up here sort of summarizes what the findings were for the trial that was looking at medical devices. So what it did is it looked at 83 clinical studies that were used to support the approval of 78 applications that were changing the design, performance, or intended use of an already approved product. And what the study found is that less than half of the studies themselves were designed properly to support the findings. So I just spoke a moment ago about adaptive clinical trials, the ability to switch from one design to another. This is saying that the sponsors of the clinical trials selected the wrong design, which then, of course, can have implications for the outcome and the data that is developed from the trials. Additionally, this study was critical, its findings were critical of whether or not these studies could effectively confirm valid predictors of clinical events, which is critical to understanding how that product will work in humans. And so this is not very good. This is a jab at our current system, but it's also a suggestion that perhaps we're going too slowly, that we're not developing enough data. And I'll bring that together for you again in just a moment. Here is a slide that really looks at the drug study, and as you might imagine from where I'm going with this, it also was critical of the way we're currently studying drugs. So it looked at 22 drugs that were granted accelerated approval, a specific approval pathway that allows sponsors to conduct conformity trials after the initial approval. And what it found is that many of those studies were never completed, or they failed to show that the drug that was approved via this process actually provides a clinical benefit to the product. So we have two critical studies, and on that same day, we have a word from Dr. Robert Califf, who, addressing both of those studies in the same publication, submitted this editorial for consideration by the industry. Now, let me back up for a second. You might remember Robert Califf as the FDA commissioner under Barack Obama. He was confirmed in February of 2016, and in many ways, in my opinion, he's like Scott Gottlieb. He was very experienced. However, critics claimed that he was way too close to the pharmaceutical industry. I think it's interesting that actually with this editorial, this is not in favor, this is not good news for the pharmaceutical or device industry. So though he started out with the same criticisms of Gottlieb, like Gottlieb, he appeared to have been a fairly objective critic of the industry that he was in charge of. Here he said that we've made things too easy, that we're going too fast. I'm paraphrasing. His quote is here in front of you, and of course you can access his words for yourself in that August 15th journal. But it really gave the media something to sink their teeth into. And around that time, we see a lot of what I have here. A lot of these headlines are intended to represent how the media picked up on these two studies, how they picked up on the editorial by Dr. Califf, and really gave critics, well, at this point, everybody, I'm arguing that everybody is a critic of our process, but those critics who believe that we're going too quickly and that the trial process isn't rigorous enough really gave them a lot of ammunition. I'm wrapping up my topic, but I thought there was no better way to do this than to describe to you what I have here as a peculiar case study in self-deregulation. And I selected this news item that got a lot of press towards the end of the summer in August and still is in the news today, and likely will be as a curiosity going forward, that I think this is a sign of the times. Here's what happened here. This is a story about a company called Rational Vaccines. They are a startup pharmaceutical company, and if you go to their website, you will see that they were formed for, I'm quoting, the purpose of offering better solutions to stop the spread of herpes and alleviate the problems faced by people suffering with unrelenting chronic disease. So the reason this is noteworthy, or the trial that they ran in April and August of 2016 is noteworthy, is that it was wholly outside FDA's regulations, as well as international law, as well as best practices. Here's what they did. They selected 20 participants from the United States who were already infected with the herpes vaccine. Now, the vaccine itself is a live virus, and it has potentially serious adverse side effects, even for people who are already infected with the disease. The company then took these 20 U.S. participants, flew them down to St. Kitts, which is a Caribbean island, and conducted the study there. The St. Kitts government was wholly unaware that this was going on at the time and have since launched an investigation into this. There was no IRB used, and there's no evidence that they followed any international rules to protect subjects or to even develop data in a way recognized with best practices. So I describe this as self-deregulation. This is simply a company that has decided that it was going to opt out of the regulatory system that is put in place to protect clinical trials and to ensure the validity of the data that they develop. Behind this study this clinical trial is a man named Peter Thiel. You might recognize his name because he was on the short list of candidates for FDA commissioner. It came down to Peter Thiel, Dr. Gottlieb, and one other candidate at one point. He was a Trump advisor with a history of investment banking, and is a member of an investment banker group that has put $7 million into this research. Thiel himself has been really outspoken about the FDA, particularly as respects the amount of time that it takes to bring products to market in the United States. And I would argue, as I have earlier in my presentation, that that's really a comment on our clinical trial process and the clinical research process. He is widely quoted as saying, "You would not be able to invent the polio vaccine today because of government regulations." Another member of his investment group, a man named Bartley Madden, claims that this trial and how it was conducted, specifically that it was deregulated, is a test case, and that's a quote, a test case to determine whether unregulated offshore trials are a viable alternative route to bringing products to market in the United States. I wanted to tell you this story because I think that this would happen, and some of this, of course, is my opinion, but I think this is something that's occurred because the industry is a bit emboldened right now, emboldened about the need to move away from these regulations that are seen as too cumbersome and too expensive, and they feel that the political atmosphere is right to try something like this. Now, the problem with this isn't just that there are ethical concerns associated with doing something like this, but the problem as a practical matter is that it's unlikely that the FDA would allow this data to be used in support of a product approval. It seems that those who were behind this trial were taking a gamble and gave it a go. I think in the end, it didn't work out very well for them. This is a headline from September of 2017, so roughly the next month after this news story broke, where it appears that they really lost their nerve and have said that they're actually not going to try this again. But I think there are some implications for us, and I want to talk a little bit about what are the grand takeaways of this. And so I think first at its heart, my prediction is that in 2018, this is clinical research, the process, clinical trials, how we're bringing products to market, is it too fast or is it too slow, is going to continue to be an issue for us. As we unravel it, I think we can expect industry to put in place some changes that are going to affect all of us going forward because it will change the way we do trials. I want to look specifically now at what are the long-term impacts for product liability risk management. That's Medmarc's specialty, and typically around here when we keep our eyes on the headlines, it is to sort of glean those nuggets of information that we think will impact our insureds, particularly their defense position in the event of product liability. So again, I think you're going to expect changes to the clinical research process. I think it's likely they're going to come in the form of options and giving industry alternative ways to develop clinical data. And there might even be some fast-tracking incentive programs around the ones that I described to you earlier that I have listed here. On the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, I do not think that FDA is likely to deregulate the entire process, and I do believe that international laws will remain applicable. At a minimum, industry needs some sort of signpost or some sort of transparency or clarity about how to bring these products to market and just exactly what FDA will consider legitimate as far as the clinical research that they develop. So I don't think we're going to see an entirely deregulated process. It will be interesting to see if anything comes from that herpes vaccine, but I'm very skeptical. And I did want to put this one headline down here at the bottom to make a point that even if it works from a regulatory standpoint, even if, and I think it's a long shot, the FDA accepted that data as a basis for approving the process, there are some long-term product liability implications. You do not want your company or your product to be the focus of a headline such as the one that I have here at the bottom of the page, where it's describing your offshore trial as sketchy. That is not a good place to be. So it's important to know that compliance and methodology, so FDA compliance, compliance with international law, compliance with best practices, as well as methodology, the quality of your clinical research and your clinical research process does creep into product liability litigation and can become an issue at trial. And what I mean by that is if it's done incorrectly, or if there is a scientific basis for saying that information about the product should have been gathered or developed differently, that will be raised by plaintiffs. And to the right of my slide here, you will see where I mentioned, 5 products, and this is not by any stretch of the imagination an exhaustive list. This is one that I developed from a quick search. 5 products that in the last 12 months or so were attacked in product liability litigation on the basis that the sponsors, the manufacturers of these products, didn't do what was right for a variety of reasons in developing the clinical research. So even if you think you can this will be my message to Peter Thiel, even if you think you can get away with a cheaper, shortcut to developing that data, be aware that after the regulatory hurdles, assuming you can pass them, there are product liability implications. Just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean that you should. And another issue I want to raise, sort of switching gears a little bit, but something to keep your eye on. I described those new methods for analyzing and developing clinical research that have been advocated by Scott Gottlieb. What's interesting, you might remember that I emphasized that he was concerned about tort exposure for FDA. Well, none of those proposed rules, and I'm thinking specifically of the right to try legislation, include any sort of liability shields for manufacturers. Now, this is not an unheard of concept. I would direct your attention to something that's known as the PrEP Act, and it is federal law that allows, under very certain circumstances, the government to ask manufacturers of unapproved products to use those products with skipping clinical trials in the case of an emergency, such as an Ebola outbreak. And if certain conditions are met within the law, that manufacturer, for a limited period of time, receives an immunity shield. They cannot be sued under a product liability theory. Well, none of those new ways that litigation will be developed, and I'm really speaking specifically to right to try, include a similar protection. So I think that's something to keep your eye on. You might be able to provide unapproved products to patients, but the question is, if something goes wrong, what is there to protect you from liability that arises from that? And there's a variety of legislative schemes out there, since this is a law that is being advanced at the state level and both the federal level, but there's very little conversation around liability shields. So those are the reasons that I would argue. I don't think that we intended, between the three of us, for this to be any sort of competition in which topic is the most serious. We pretty much, I think, agree on the topics we've selected, but for the reasons that I've outlined, I do think that we're going to hear a lot more about clinical research going forward. For now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn things over to Kate Klaus, who is going to talk a little bit about FDA's pilot programs and their changing vision.
Thanks, Sarah. We wanted to shift gears and talk a little bit about FDA's changes for the coming year, because it really affects how our policyholders need to prepare themselves to operate in a changing environment. So we thought that one of the places to best start would be with FDA inspections, because it affects so many of our policyholders on a regular basis, and because it's something that you can take actions to better prepare for. So FDA inspections always make for a fairly hot headline because of the imagery. We have some animation issues here. It's easy to picture federal agents swarming in with padlocks and crime scene tape, but the reality is usually far less flashy, inspection drones aside, which is that article in the back there. However, there have been a number of headlines recently about FDA's changing device inspection model that, while they might not make the evening news, they're of great interest to regulated industry. So let's start by taking a look at some of those changes. First, we have the inspection model that is driven by FDA's program alignment. So this is a change to the inspection protocol driven by a reorganization of FDA's Office of Regulatory Affairs, known as ORA. The ORA has always operated using a geographic model with various field offices located throughout the country and around the world, so that they can maintain regular contact with industry regardless of their distance from DC and FDA's headquarters. Investigators located in these offices were expected to be generalists and able to inspect any number of facilities in their regions. ORA's specialty has always been regulatory enforcement rather than any particular product model. But FDA has come to recognize that technology has rapidly outpaced this former model. Manufacturers are specialists, and in order to conduct adequate inspections, FDA has realized that its investigators need to be specialists as well. It no longer makes sense for all investigators to be able to inspect, for example, both pharmaceutical manufacturing and medical device software engineering. The necessary knowledge base is far too broad to allow for the in-depth inspections we need to ensure patient safety. So while ORA will still maintain its field offices, the employees will now be aligned by product area, much like FDA's centers, with drug, device, and biologic experts working alongside one another. This program went into effect on May 15th of this year, and going forward, companies should expect that subject matter experts will be conducting their inspections, and they need to prepare accordingly. The first change that companies can expect to see is with regard to communication and transparency. The notification that an inspection is coming should be clearer. There should be more flexibility in terms of scheduling. Staffing is going to be a slower process, particularly when you're talking about a government agency. So seeing new investigators and working with new recall coordinators will be the first step, but it's going to take some time to build the deep subject matter expertise. But industry needs to take a proactive stance here. This is something you can prepare for, and it's something you should prepare for. FDA is not going to announce when their subject matter experts are fully prepared, and it's every company's responsibility to be ready for that day before it comes. In another major shift for device firms, FDA is also changing how it decides which facilities to inspect. Previously, regulations allowed for routine inspection of device establishments once every 2 years, based upon the date of the company's registration with FDA. But with the enactment of the FDA Reauthorization Act of 2017, FDA now has the authority to set its inspection calendar and allocate its resources according to the risks presented. So this practice was successfully implemented for drug facilities in 2015, and under FDARA can now begin for devices. In order to keep the selection of sites somewhat objective, there are certain risk factors that are identified in the legislation that FDA can look to in determining the risk. So they will look at who has been inspecting the facility, whether it's FDA or foreign entities, and how often the inspections have been conducted. They'll look at critical quality measures through companies' histories of inspections and any deficiencies that might have been noted. They'll look at the inherent risks provided by the devices manufactured at the facility. Certainly a Class 3 device facility is going to require more regular and more in-depth inspection than a Class 1 device facility, particularly if you're talking about life-sustaining products. So those cannot be neglected. And then finally, events like product recalls, which can be red flags for quality problems, will also be considered. So that's another reason why a focus on quality is so critical, even before this becomes FDA's regular approach. If you can improve your compliance at this point, it will serve you better going forward. It will be interesting to see, I think, how inspection outcomes change in FDA's annual reporting on inspections and 483 data. The top observations have been fairly consistent over the last decade, and for the most part, the same 5 deficiencies have served as the basis for a disproportionately large number of all observations. So might this change as investigators become more attuned to the particulars of device technology, or as more attention is paid to riskier products and companies with a history of compliance deficiencies? Time will tell. Our next look at changing device inspections is MDSAP, the Medical Device Single Audit Program. This is a program that's been in the works since around 2012. It was developed by the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, building on the work of the Global Harmonization Task Force on Medical Devices. To date, 5 member states have signed on to participate in the program: the US, Canada, Australia, Brazil, and Japan. And what the program does is set an audit protocol that meets the regulatory requirements of all of the participating member states and can be used to satisfy the regulators in any of those nations. So, for example, if a US firm that distributes domestically and in South America is inspected by FDA, then FDA's inspection should suffice for the Brazilian regulators as well. And for firms inspected by one of the foreign participants, FDA intends to treat the MDSAP audits just as it does an FDA inspection, using the MDSAP scores to assign its traditional official action indicated, voluntary action indicated, no action indicated classification. So if an audit notes any nonconformities with a high score of 5, or if there are multiple scores of 4, then FDA would, of course, declare that an official OAI, official action indicated inspection. So far, this is a voluntary program in all of the member states except for Canada. Health Canada is requiring an MDSAP audit for all entities distributing in Canada by January of 2019. This means that companies have about a year to get this completed in order to have time to correct any nonconformities by that January 1st deadline if they're going to continue distribution in Canada. In addition to audits, FDA inspections, there have been a lot of headlines about new programs that FDA has on its agenda for the upcoming year and going forward. So these improvements are targeted to benefit both patients and industry with the intention to better balance both product quality and patient safety against the interests of industry in getting its innovations to market with a limited regulatory burden. It is a very difficult balance to achieve, and you can see on this FDA Voice blog from 2015, it is something that's been in the works for several years. Some of the other items on the FDA's agenda include streamlining of the pre-market concerns, post-market surveillance, and quality compliance functions through creation of the TPLC super office. The goal is to increase the efficiency by allowing FDA to make faster decisions and decrease decision times by bringing cross-agency parties together. It goes hand in hand with some of the other ideas on this list of new programs. The case for quality has been a focus of FDA for several years. The Voluntary Compliance Improvement Program allows companies to stray a bit from FDA's traditional oversight model. It allows firms to audit, use auditors, and self-identify and correct regulatory infractions instead of going through an FDA inspection. The types of problems that are regularly identified are the same types of quality system violations that we see in FDA 483s. So this is something that allows companies to build a history with FDA so that FDA can come to trust more the health of their quality system and therefore give them a bit more leeway going forward. This is a strategy that comes up a bit in some of the other ideas that FDA has for improving the efficiency and quality. Another is the Digital Health Software Pre-Certification. This is a pilot program that's been in the news quite a bit recently, talking about Apple and Fitbit, how they have been selected as participants in this pilot program. FDA recognizes that its traditional approach to approving new products is really not suited for the fast developing and rapid innovation of the software world, as well as the demand for the products that are created in this way. So FDA has created this voluntary pilot program that takes a tailored approach to this specific type of technology. They look at the software developer and their methods rather than at the product itself. So they go back to the quality system. Was the appropriate quality system structure followed in creating the software? If that's the case, then it's more likely that the product is acceptable for the market. So the hope of FDA is that they will be able to take this tailored mechanism and not only limit it to software, but the idea going forward really is to better streamline and target for particular technologies themselves. These are all tied into the pre-market approval critical to quality pilot program as well. This is again a voluntary pilot program that is aimed at evaluating device design and manufacturing process quality. So if they go back to, again, these critical compliance factors that influence product safety, they're better able to determine the appropriateness of the product for the market. It isn't necessarily dependent on the moment in time inspection, pre-approval inspection that is typically done today. Finally, this is something that may be of interest to a lot of companies with regard to medical device reporting, reporting of adverse events. FDA is considering allowing summary reporting, quarterly reporting, rather than within 30 calendar days, as is the current requirement. So the pilot program is complete. There are pros and cons for both agency and for the industry. For companies that don't have a lot of MDRs, this may not be the best approach for them. It may not save them that much time. But for companies that are receiving larger numbers of adverse events that may be similar to one another, it gives them more time to conduct their investigation before they have to report back to FDA. They might have better answers, and things that aren't necessarily attributable to the device can be ruled out and corrected before they actually become a problem. It grants the manufacturer more leeway than it has at this point to conduct a full and thorough investigation and give that full picture to FDA when they are ready, rather than as the calendar necessitates. Finally, at FDA's, or excuse me, at AdvaMed's MedTech conference, the conference closed again with the CDRH Town Hall, in which Dr. Jeffrey Shuren, who's the director of CDRH, and a number of his colleagues at the center had a long discussion with industry participants who attended the conference, and they talked about a number of approaches that they're working on that seem to be really beneficial toward this cooperative environment they're attempting to rebuild anyway with industry. One of these is the least burdensome approach, a flexible regulatory paradigm for product approvals. What this does is look at whether the agency is taking a tailored approach to reviewing product applications. And it's something that companies have to be cognizant of as well when they are filing applications. What the agency is looking for is not necessarily the kitchen sink approach of throwing any information they have at their application, hoping that FDA will dig out what's necessary and leave the rest. It is understanding what is required to make a decision on the product and providing the best information you have, and only as much as is necessary. It's a difficult approach at this point because there is somewhat a lack of trust between industry and the agency. This is something that will take some time to come about for most companies, because they are going to have to learn where that balance is. How much do they need to submit before it's too much, and to ensure that they don't get a letter stating that there isn't sufficient information to clear or approve their product. In the same way, the agency is considering, as Sarah mentioned, the use of real-world evidence in its evaluations. They're taking a look at information about product use that is out there that may not necessarily come from a sponsor's clinical trials. It may be literature, it may be product use for off-label use. They're not necessarily considering where the source is, but rather what does it tell them about the product. They're also looking toward shifting some of the decision between what is a useful product and what is too risky to providers and the users by evaluating benefits over risks versus the current approach, which is more of a risk focus. The goal is really to get products, new innovative treatments that are needed to patients without creating too much of a burden on them. It's a fine line to walk, but it is something that has become a focus over the last several years and will continue to be so going forward. And finally, this is it's a topic that comes up generally each year at this conference, talking about CDRH investing in its employees, building a collaborative culture with industry, and enhancing their customer service relationship rather than their policing role. But it's something they talk about every year. It hasn't exactly come to fruition yet. It's something to watch for sure, and it would be wonderful if it actually did happen. But again, this is something that is going to be impacted by the lack of trust at the present time between industry and agency. To close, I wanted to bring it back to product liability and how the regulatory scheme can have some impact on product liability vulnerability for manufacturers. Most importantly, it's critical to remember that regulations are always the floor and not the ceiling, and the plaintiff's bar is always watching. If you are not meeting your FDA enforcement or your FDA compliance obligations, they will be watching for 483s, they will be watching for warning letters, they'll be watching for recalls, and these are things that alert them to potential sources of litigation. Also, some of these changes that are coming about for FDA's standards, like medical device reporting of adverse events, we need to think about whether these changing standards could later impact companies and their product liability approach. Could delayed MDR reporting, delayed from the current standard, impact companies' vulnerability with regard to duty to warn? Would they be able to gather the information they need about similar products in sufficient time? Could they possibly be delaying recalls because the information has not been aggregated? And finally, with global harmonization of the inspection standards, could it possibly lead to further litigation abroad? The U.S. system has always been the one that carries greater litigation concerns, and it's been far less so overseas. It remains to be seen, of course, but could this change with greater harmonization of regulations? And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Courtney.
All right, thanks, Kate. So I will be looking at cybersecurity, which is the third topic I thought that really emerged this year as sort of a prominent issue for life sciences companies. And looking at it, we can just kind of see that these headlines are some of the things that are really demonstrating that this is a big issue, and it's manifesting in different ways. So we've got ransomware, we've got hacking, and really an acknowledgement and understanding that medical devices are so vulnerable. So why is this, and why is this something important? Why is this something that deserving of our attention? Well, medical devices have changed. They've gone from these isolated pieces of equipment to maybe equipment that has this one-way vendor monitoring to these really networked, wireless, multifunctional, capable devices. And with that, vulnerability has really increased. So most of these changes have meant really positive things, and one of them being that we can take these devices into environments that we never thought we could before. But it also means that different environments mean greater vulnerabilities and greater points at which hacking can occur. So hacking is definitely one such manifestation of this risk. Cyber incidents from potential adversaries who may inflict cyber attacks have significantly increased, and we've seen now that it's become more than just the stuff of Homeland and of 24, and that really the possibilities that were once imagined are very real. We see that the interconnected nature and network capability of devices mean that all devices and all systems in a network are vulnerable. So even where our former worst-case scenario might have been the control of the device, now we're seeing that the risk doesn't end at the device itself, but because of its placement on this huge network, this whole system becomes vulnerable. So what does this mean? Well, at least among other things, from our perspective, it means the device makers will face liability. And we're really seeing that now. And I think one of the most significant things with all these lawsuits that we're seeing, and then also regulatory enforcement actions, is sometimes it's not even necessary that real damage has been done or that real information has been breached. It is enough that this vulnerability was exposed and that either patient health information or control over device was at issue, and that will be a source of liability going forward. And so what are the different sources of liability? Well, one, and you know, the one that Kate and Sarah and I spend most of our time on, is product liability. So because of a cybersecurity vulnerability or a hack or another even coding failure, the device can cause property damage or bodily injury. And so the company is going to be faced with product liability. Of course, the one that we might hear most about is a privacy and data breach vulnerability. So, for example, patient health information is breached. There's also a significant source of contractual liability among these different parties that are contracting expecting that the device with whom or the device maker with whom they're contracting with has a very secure device. And when that isn't the case, or when information is breached, they're often going to have contractual remedies. Often when there's an economic loss that might be barred in tort, it can be pursued at the contractual level. So that's going to be a big source of liability for device makers. So looking at how has FDA been grappling with this, they're seeing the same headlines we are, and are obviously very concerned because they really recognize that it's a patient health issue. So kind of their approach generally, they seem to be going at this effort with a real collaborative mission in a sense that the agency doesn't have all the answers in this area. It's really looking to industry to communicate when there is a vulnerability, really trying to foster this collaborative environment amongst different companies, and even kind of playing with, well, how do we not only incentivize positive action, but even reward these good actors that are sharing this information with us. The other big prong of FDA's approach is the requirement that companies be proactive. So again, not only will they face liability, but also some enforcement actions when they haven't demonstrated that they've got this culture of cybersecurity throughout the organization, and that they've adopted, really through the design phase and through their quality management system, a priority on patient safety from closing those cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So in this area, there's two, somewhat recent, I think the first was in 2014 and the second one got finalized this year, guidance documents that are solely focused on cybersecurity. Although they're far from the only guidance documents that medical device companies should lean on in this area. And just to mention a few others that would be important, there's one on interoperability, there's one specifically on network devices, and there's another guidance document that's actually fairly old, I want to say maybe 2012, that's on the use of off-the-shelf software. So all of those are going to be important. But the two ones on cybersecurity, the first of these is focusing on Premarket. And the biggest items in this guidance is that cybersecurity must be designed into the product. The design phase has to include a thorough consideration of all of the possible vulnerabilities and how the company has addressed all of these different vulnerabilities. The second, I think, big takeaway from this guidance document is that it's a shared responsibility issue. There's a recognition that although the device maker can deploy a patch, it's sometimes up to the user to install that. But because the FDA's purview obviously is over the device makers, they really are concentrating on having the device makers make it as easy as possible for end users and operators to make the devices secure. So the responsibility, while it is shared, the biggest thrust of that is going to land squarely on the manufacturers, both from a liability perspective again, and then from a regulatory perspective. The second guidance I mentioned, the post-market guidance, this really emphasizes communication, and again, the responsibility of the manufacturer to communicate back with the agency and then, of course, to end users about any breaches or even suspected vulnerabilities. The second thing I thought was a good takeaway in this guidance was that it really brings in the NIST framework, and I'll kind of talk about that next here. So NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, issued this cybersecurity framework in 2014, and it's sort of become the gold standard. It's referenced in a lot of the other guidance documents of other agencies, including DHS and DOJ, and it really takes you through a framework for addressing and improving cybersecurity and critical infrastructure. So I think it's worthwhile, even though they're up here, to kind of go through them. So identifying the risks, and this really looks at, is it a network-connected device? Does it have accessible data ports? Where will it be used? And sort of getting at the end game of, who would be affected. Then to protect, so does that mean limiting access? Does it mean strengthening passwords or changing password requirements? Are there physical locks? Are there steps of access? Should they have different levels of access? For instance, someone who can just view the data and another person that has the option to change controls. Then detect, so how do we know, can we put in features into the device that will let us know when there has been a breach, so not just a vulnerability, but an actual threat? And then how do we respond and plan that out and even do some, testing scenarios and really work through your response plan? And then finally recover. So how are you going to get the device back to a state of functionality and protection of the information, and how do we recover what information may or may not have been lost? So I wanted to finish just my FDA approach here on some common regulatory misconceptions. And this is a focus of the FDA has felt these misconceptions so seriously that they put out this fact sheet to kind of clear these up. And I've linked that at the bottom. I should mention each of these slides does have the link either at the bottom or right embedded in the slide. And I think that should work when you get the slides. So they'll be linked right to the guidance documents. But in this fact sheet, they really wanted to spell a couple myths. And I heard someone from FDA at a conference last week that really emphasized these again. And it does seem like there are a few pervasive misconceptions of the industry. So one of them is that there's some regulatory bar for device makers who want to produce an update to their device that just updates cybersecurity. There was some thought, do you have to, is that a 510K process, or, is there additional hurdles from a regulatory standpoint to making your device safer? The answer, at least from this FDA representative, was an emphatic no, that they, of course, don't want there to be any hindrances to updating the cybersecurity of your device, and that they treat these as just updates, and you can almost, I want to say almost, because of course there's a caveat out there somewhere, but you can almost always update your device for cybersecurity alone. The second misconception is that FDA conducts some kind of pre-market testing for medical products. This responsibility is solely on the medical device maker. The FDA does not do this. It wants you to do this, but it has no responsibility for doing this. And finally, and this is has some implications in product liability too, so I thought it was important to mention that medical device manufacturers using off-the-shelf software are responsible for ensuring its safe and effective performance in the medical device. So it is not necessarily the responsibility of the off-the-shelf software manufacturer to make sure that it functions in your device. And you can't really disclaim responsibility or liability for those adverse events that arise out of off-the-shelf software that you've incorporated into your device. You are, again, responsible for testing and making sure that those function together. So given that, what are some takeaways? And I wanted to kind of drill down, given this huge issue this past year, and in my opinion, one that's only going to get bigger going forward, what advice could we give our life sciences companies to help mitigate these associated risks? So I think the biggest one would be embrace that culture of cybersecurity, not only because FDA is essentially making you, but because it's really smart from a product liability perspective and from an overall risk management perspective. So you're going to face liability whether or not something goes wrong, if there's the possibility of something going wrong, if there's that reasonable foreseeability of a cybersecurity vulnerability that you have not addressed. So really, throughout your organization, make cybersecurity a priority before it's a problem. I think the second thing, and it really goes together, is comply with FDA regulations. I put the statistic up here. Every few years, Medmarc does a panel of its a survey of its very qualified defense panel of attorneys that defend product liability actions for medical device makers. And we try to, ask them, how are life sciences companies doing? What could they do better? Well, in this survey, in I think 2015, 59% of our attorneys indicated that in at least half their cases, plaintiffs or their attorneys became aware of the cause of action because of an FDA enforcement action, like a recall, 483, or warning letter. So I know Kate really emphasized this too, but if there's no other reason for compliance, and there is, there's certainly a product liability reason. So you don't want to give the plaintiffs bar any more fodder for a lawsuit than having a poor regulatory action. And of course, so there's not only a product liability, but there's a regulatory implications to a failure to comply, and that really goes hand in hand with adopting that full cybersecurity culture. I think my last takeaway would be, second to last, designing out the risk. So this is really emphasized in NIST and FDA's cybersecurity guidance, but it's not adequate, really never, from a product liability standpoint, but maybe particularly in the cybersecurity context. You can't just warn of a vulnerability. You can't just warn that your data may be breached. You have to address these concerns at the design phase, and you have to design devices that are able to be patched, are able to be updated, and really equipped to fix cyber vulnerabilities as you become aware of them. So putting in your instructions for use or your warnings or labels just isn't adequate in this area. And finally, I would say to focus on your legacy products. I think the industry is really aware of this issue. I think Deloitte did a poll last year amongst medical device executives, and 30.1% of them indicated that mitigating risks of fielded legacy devices was the biggest challenge facing their industry. So I think that's really positive in that they're really aware that this is an issue, but we continue to see these headlines, and I think we will continue to, about these legacy devices really posing some cybersecurity problems because they weren't designed maybe to be as patchable, as deployable, and there isn't the same benefit or investment incentives for companies to focus on these products because they're not selling them anymore. But I think that that would be a mistake, and that would be an oversight to ignore the benefit of spending some resources on these legacy products. And I think it's going to be a significant source of liability in the next year. So I know I ran through that, but we're right up past the hour. And with that, we're going to turn to our speed round. So in this, we're each going to kind of go around and look at some of the big headlines from the year and try to distill it down and say what would be the takeaways for life sciences companies. So, I think I'll take this first one. I think this was Merck, but I think we could have put any one of the several, Abbott or St. Jude or any of these big cyber attacks from the past year, and the takeaway being the same. I don't think that this is an issue that's necessarily going away. I think you have all different entities in government working towards solutions for this, but I think the takeaway from this would really be to adhere to all of those guidance documents, to all the standards that are out there right now, and try to make sure that this isn't you. And the next one.
This is one I selected, Courtney. This is Sarah speaking. This is a headline from Time magazine, though it is just one of numerous. And I selected it because it details a notable technology-related event in 2017. Specifically, on August 30th of this year, FDA approved the first gene-altering therapy. So this is a therapy that is going to be used when traditional therapies for cancer treatment don't work. The specific product is designed to treat a condition called acute lymphoblastic leukemia, sometimes abbreviated as ALL, and it can be used in patients between the ages of 3 and 25. What's interesting about it is really the way that it works, the theory behind the science. And reportedly, it involves removing the patient's cells, the patient's own cells, re-engineering them, and returning them to the patient, after which the modified cells locate and destroy the cancer cells. I've heard some people describe this as like a Pac-Man theory of cancer treatment. And this particular product that received its approval on August 30th is already being tested in use of other types of cancers. Well, recently, on October 18th, the FDA approved a second therapy, and actually I think the Time article is relating to the second therapy specifically. The concept works the same. It, however, is being used to treat B-cell lymphoma. And the reason I thought this was important is because everything that I've read about this tells me that this is opening a new era of medicine. This is going to change the way we think about cancer, the way we think about fighting cancer. And I thought, if that's the case, then we need to mark the new era, at least by observing the entrance of these two products onto the market.
Okay. Thanks, Sarah. So I'll take this one. So this was a huge issue. It started kind of with the EpiPen, but we had 20 states file a suit this year against these two big drugs, but a bunch of manufacturers were named in it on a price fixing and conspiracy to price fix. I think the takeaway on this is pretty obvious, but that you've really got to have, because of all the FTC and Consumer Product Safety Boards, you've really got to have some reasonable relationship to investment and expense, and consumers are just really, I think these lawsuits will become more popular depending on the outcome of this. This is still in litigation. It looks like they're going back and forth. I saw a amended complaint was submitted just last month. So the outcome of this will certainly determine where these lawsuits go, but I think that consumers have sensed an opportunity, or maybe I should say more accurately, the plaintiff's bar has sensed an opportunity here when they see these, 2,000% drug increases. And of course, we know how expensive it is to bring a product to market, but I think there's got to, be mindful of that relationship of investment to price.
I can take this one. I thought this was a really interesting study. It was done by the Yale School of Medicine in regard to drugs that developed safety problems or had safety problems come to light after their FDA approval. There's been a growing number of these products over the years, and it goes back to what Sarah was saying about the clinical trial system and the rapid pace of FDA approvals. What was really interesting in this study was that they found a lot of these issues were coming in several years after approval for drugs that were either the focus of an accelerated approval or were approved near the regulatory deadline. It speaks to whether FDA is rushing or if they're taking their time, and also the structure of the clinical trials themselves. Many of them had too few subjects, maybe took too little time to evaluate the drug, and therefore didn't gather the necessary information that might have shown some of these effects that developed several years after approval. And of course, this could have an impact as far as product liability is concerned if the design of the drug is found to be the source of the injury.
So this is Sarah again. With this one, I'm not going to provide a lot of background information on this because you can't turn a television on or a web browser without seeing an article or information about what's going on with opioids. It's a terrible problem, and it's received a lot of attention this year, as it should, from FDA and other agencies. It's also become the subject of litigation, and that's really where I'm going to stick to with why I think this is so significant this year. And let me be clear. It's not just that this is significant for this year. I think part of the reason it's significant is that it's going to be significant in years to come. Right now, there has been described as a chorus of plaintiffs who are attacking drug makers or the manufacturers of these products, including state attorneys general from Alabama, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Colorado, Texas, Tennessee, Massachusetts, Missouri, Ohio, and New Hampshire. I don't know that that list is exhaustive, and it seems like there may be more on the horizon. There's also counties that are going after the manufacturers of these products, municipalities also, most notably Chicago, the Cherokee Nation, and then individual consumers. Just within the last few weeks, we heard about a proposed class action filed in Arkansas that could have some product liability implications down the road. It depends on what happens with that class and whether or not it's actually certified and moves forward. But in part, the claims are based on the plaintiff's allegations that the drug manufacturers put out deceptive product warnings and deceptive marketing practices that underplayed the addictive properties of opioids. So why is this significant? Because, first of all, it's going to be very expensive for manufacturers of these products, and it's going to take a long time to get through the litigation. I think in many respects, we should look to the tobacco litigation of the 1990s as sort of a template of where we're going, because we seem to be following that same pattern. If you're familiar with what happened with tobacco litigation, there were numerous government actions that preceded a wave of claims from consumers for harm from that product. So I think that just like tobacco, if we're following the template, these cases are going to become very difficult and expensive, with an emphasis on expensive, to defend, which is going to push manufacturers of opioids against. Now, this is a prediction into settling these cases because the cost of defending them will just be too great. Looking back at tobacco agreed as an industry, agreed to pay government entities a minimum of $206 billion over the first 25 years of that agreement. We don't know how much tobacco spent on consumer claims. There's a variety of reasons we don't know those totals, but we do know from regulatory filings from R.J. Reynolds that at one point they were facing $300 million in damages. So many of those cases are currently on appeal, so we don't know exactly what happened. But the point is that the cost burden of defending this becomes so great that it pushes industry into settlement agreements. So I'm looking for that to happen. I'm looking for a sweep in litigation from consumers and strong pressure on industry to settle. I think there are also some long-term consequences, just as we saw with tobacco. I think this litigation, the pressure, including media pressure, but as well as the pressure from litigation, consumer groups, doctors groups, that we will see industry begin to make concessions, just as tobacco did. Likely it will, over the long term, require physicians to change their prescribing practices, but more for our insureds. I think it can have some long-term impacts on how companies warn about hazards, particularly with products that have addictive properties, but we also may see some new theories in how to make warnings more effective for consumers and for patients directly. So I think we should look to that to unfold over the next several years.
Okay, I'll take this one. First, I just thought it was cool that there's a life sciences headline in Rolling Stone. You don't see that very often. So I think the takeaway here is that medtech and particularly pharma has a real perception problem. They're difficult defendants because, oddly, the public doesn't have that kind of a perception of these companies, and they think of them as huge, kind of unfeeling and profit-centered companies. Nothing helps that like Pharma Bro Martin Shkreli. So I think that was just the takeaway here, that it looks like they'll kind of continue to face this perception problem, and that can be a real hindrance and a real obstacle in product liability. I think that's at least part of the reason a lot of these suits get settled, because there's a difficult jury pool, and headlines and behavior like this makes it a more difficult jury pool.
I thought this was a really interesting article because of the way the line was drawn by FDA between practice of medicine and manufacturing of unapproved drugs. So FDA made it quite clear that these unproven stem cell therapies are not the practice of medicine. They are very much products, and they very much require FDA oversight. And they reached out to several clinics who were selling these drugs, these treatments, and shut down that practice. So it's something to evaluate going forward. While these may be beneficial treatments in a number of venues, they require a demonstration of safety and efficacy and approval by FDA before they can be given to patients.
Great. Okay, at that, I think we'll go into our Q&A. I know we're over the time, but it looks like we have time for a couple questions anyway. Sarah, I think this one's probably for you. Will a business-friendly environment result in more product liability litigation?
Not necessarily. So I think that if we have a systemic problem, as we might have when it comes to clinical research, depending on where we come down on that issue, if it's ever definitively resolved, if we have a problem with the way we're collecting data, then we have a problem with the way we're designing products. And so that could be a problem. So if the system is broken and it's skewed in favor of companies developing products, I think in the long term, yes, that could be a problem. But speaking more to what I think Kate addressed in her slides regarding some of the FDA initiatives, as well as what I think we all touched on it, if this environment is considered or viewed as pro-business or friendly to business, that doesn't necessarily have to translate into product liability problems. We certainly want the FDA to help companies bring their products to market, or that's just an untenable place to be. So assuming that even if it is business friendly, on the other hand, I think that what we need to look at more carefully are the cultures of the independent organizations, the companies themselves. Do they have an eye on product safety? Do they understand the connection between their quality, the quality practices, the quality system, their view of quality, and potential product liability litigation? And I think Kate said it best, the FDA has created a floor in its regulations, not a ceiling. And I have personally had good experiences with this industry and seeing that they are wishing to put out quality products that in turn are safe and not the subject of litigation.
Okay, I have one. Where do you think regulation is going with respect to cybersecurity? In the absence of hard and fast laws, what advice would you give companies? I think I probably already said this, but I guess two parts. So where regulation I think is going, I think the government is definitely trying to coalesce around some hard and fast standards for at least maybe testing of devices and what the permissible risk is, and then what the responsibility. They're trying to allocate responsibility of end users and operators, and between them and between makers and manufacturers. They acknowledge there's a shared responsibility, but where does that allocation, what line is drawn? I think that's going to be really hard and slow coming, and my advice to life sciences companies in the absence of these would be to adhere to all of the standards. And I know there's so many. There's NIST and UL and ISO and FDA. Unfortunately, as Kate and Sarah both said, these are they are floors and not ceilings, and it's just too easy for a plaintiff's attorney to point to the one standard that industry uses and you don't. So I think, utilize those as much as you can. The good news is they're really not in conflict with each other. They're really consistent, and some of it's duplicative, so that makes it even easier. But I think those at least big ones, the FDA guidance is NIST, ISO, and UL are really a good starting point for life sciences companies. It looks like I've got one more here, and it sounds like it's for Kate. Kate, what advice would you give to a startup about being prepared for inspections in the new environment?
I think it would be, don't be afraid to ask questions. It's important to figure out what you need to do, what your obligations are under the regulations, and if you don't understand or you aren't sure if you're meeting your obligations appropriately, there are many, many consultants out there. There are regulatory attorneys, and there's our risk management department here who are always available to help you and to make sure that you are on the right course. So your best bet is really to be proactive. Make sure you've developed a good system, that you're following your own SOPs, you're documenting your work, and if you have questions, seek help.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, Kate, and Courtney. This was terrific insight on the headlines impacting our industry today. Thank you for joining us. This concludes our webinar.